Okay, it's 12:30, so let's go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone on this sunny Wednesday afternoon. I appreciate accommodating the slight time change as we often do these on Fridays. And thanks to everyone for coming. It's exciting to see so many familiar faces, but also new ones. Welcome to our lunch lecture today, which is with Rufus Burnett Jr., whose lecture today is entitled Blue Notes on Flesh, Regenerating Intimacy in a Racialized World, which is a really great title. This event is brought to you by the Nanovic Institute for European Studies. My name is Abby Lewis. I'm the Director of Undergraduate Studies of this institute, as well as a postdoctoral researcher. The Nanovic Institute for European Studies, founded 30 years ago, has a strategic plan that invites us to think about peripheries in European studies and the big questions around Europe today, including aspects of colonialism and dynamics of peripheralization. Last semester, we launched this speaker series with a commitment to decenter the center in European studies and to listen to voices that are typically underrepresented in dominant understandings of our past and present. Decolonizing is an intentional effort to rethink thinking, to unlearn learning, to create new practices, and we plan to have deep conversations that will hopefully inform our practices. The Decolonizing Scholarship Series is the first project that fell into my lap when I started a year ago as a postdoctoral research associate. And Clemens brought me a really impressive list of nominations of speakers that were provided from all of you, provided by chairs and professors from across this university. And we are so grateful for the participation of everyone in this project. And just from that list, we've been able to now invite 3 semesters worth of speakers from across disciplines. And for me, it's really amounted to a truly exciting conversation about what decolonial practices mean and how that looks different across different disciplines. So thank you all for your participation in this project. We, of course, owe Becca Prince a lot of thanks, who organizes all of our events and does multiple events per week and doesn't really show that she's doing multiple events per week. So we're always just really grateful to Becca. And we'll continue this series during the 2023-24 academic year, so into the spring, where we'll look at this question from different angles and disciplinary perspectives. While this is the last talk of the semester, next semester we will welcome Hannah Feldman, who is an art historian from Northwestern. We are also rescheduling Liddy Mudolino's talk entitled Poaching French Theory. So to introduce our speaker, we have Dr. Stephen Batten, who's an assistant professor of systematic theology here at Notre Dame, and who I've learned has been a longtime colleague, mentor, and friend of Professor Burnett. Thank you, Stephen.
Well, thank you. I'm honored this afternoon to introduce Professor Rufus Burnett. Rufus is an assistant professor of systematic theology at Fordham University. His work integrates decolonial theory, Africana religious studies, and theology through the lens of cultural production. Rufus and I share a common undergraduate alma mater, Xavier University of Louisiana, the only Black Catholic university in the Western Hemisphere, and I believe it still holds the record for the only university in the United States founded by a saint. So I had to do that shout out. Rufus received his master's in systematic theology from Loyola University in New Orleans, and his doctorate in systematic theology from Duquesne in 2016. I have to say I first met, as was mentioned, I first met Rufus really 18 years ago in New Orleans, Louisiana, the summer before Hurricane Katrina. So we've had many conversations since then about theology, race, and I guess you'd say the civilizational and Eurocentric arts of domination over the years. So I also had the pleasure of coordinating with Rufus on different ventures in the summer of 2015. We both drove down to Jackson, Mississippi to attend the U.S. Social Forum, which is an offshoot of the World Social Forum. So we've been trying to be committed to this sort of thing for some time. We've done panels together at various venues. The Philosophy Born of Struggle Conference in 2015, the World Forum of Theology and Liberation in Montreal, Quebec in 2016, In 2019, we did a panel together at the Catholic Theological Society of America, the CTSA, for the theological reflections on grassroots alternatives for post-capitalist and decolonial futures. And so I was going to say that we've done quite a lot together. So I really appreciate Dr. Burnett's work. He is the author of Decolonizing Revelation, a Spatial Reading of the Blues. He has several books, chapters, and articles exploring the decolonial potential of blues epistemology. A particular thread of note running throughout his work is the relationship between racialized peoples in the United States and in the land. I'm not sure if you're going to hear some of that today, but that's something very important in Professor Burnett's thought, so I thought I should highlight it. And Rufus's commitment to decolonizing scholarship goes beyond his publications. In the professional associations in which he's participated, he's quickly been invited into leadership roles, for instance, in the short-lived Transgressive Theology Group, the Ecumenical Association of Third World Theologians, ETWAT. He has been on the administrative team for the World Forum for Theology and Liberation, and he is one of a 3-person team responsible for jumpstarting the Decolonizing Catholic Theology Interest Group meeting at the Catholic Theological Society of America. At Fordham, his service to the university with respect to decolonizing scholarship has also included things such as participation in the Center on Religion and Culture series on race and faith, where Rufus was instrumental in bringing Leah Perriman to speak. She's the founder of Soulfire Forum, an Afro-Indigenous centered community farm committed to uprooting racism and seeding sovereignty in the food system. Rufus has also helped in leading internal conversations about the significance of decolonial thinking in Fordham's theology department. So he is someone who is truly committed to this endeavor. The last thing I will note is that Rufus is currently working on a second book project tentatively titled Blue Notes on Being, in which he uses the blues note as a hermeneutic key for both interpreting Black religion in the United States and theorizing the difference, and we might say the colonial difference, between Black religious consciousness and the standard modern categories of religion and ethnic racial identity. So I truly appreciate the work he's doing. I thank the Nanovic Institute for the series and in inviting our speaker for today. So please join me in welcoming our guest, Rufus Burnett.
This computer is way larger than I see.
You don't need it.
Okay, sure. All right. So, when one introduces you after knowing you for 18 some odd years, the only thing you can do after hearing it and all of its splendor is say the thing you really want to say, and that is, Stephen, I love you. It's good to be back. I was here from 2016 to 2018, and this place was a formative juke joint for me. I was very happy to enjoy vibrations from the Africana Studies Department, Diane Penderhughes. I was a member of the first year of studies, where Hugh Page was our backbeat and our front beat to helping students to matriculate into their majors. Also, Hugh gave me an archival experience that required me to be at the top of O'Shaughnessy at 11:30 at night for the Blues Review, which was a radio station where I hosted once a week. And when he bequeathed that to me, I felt something, and much of that work has given me so many engagements with blues singers that I had not known, some that I did and reappreciated. So this is a great space. It's a sonic space for me, as well as a place where so many of you have poured into my life. Corey, your Barty, Richard Pierce, so many others. But I do want to thank Rebecca and Abigail for all their work in getting me here. We've been in conversation for almost a year now to this moment. And I also want to thank Scott Barton, who invited me to his class the other night. That was just a wonderful, wonderful experience. The Nanovic Institute has my deep gratitude for having me here and for putting together this series on decolonial scholarship. So many illustrious scholars in the mix. I'm still wondering how I made the cut. But here we are. So let's get started. To be racialized, sorry about this. Yeah, it wasn't. I need the keyboard.
You actually need the keyboard after all.
Yeah, I
There
do.
you go.
I'm gonna start with you, possibly put the mic on.
Oh,
A little high. I think maybe.
it's not on. It's not on. Thank you.
Oh, there we
Oh,
go.
thanks.
Yeah, that's better. Okay. Right. All right. So since we are going to be talking about poesis, I thought it was apropos to begin in a fit of the sound of the poetic.
They wanted her piecemeal, paper-mache, practically broken, limp-like and loveless, a litany of exaggeration. They wanted her low and high, flat and wide, filled with all of their empty. They wanted her to be more like them, not knowing her conception was immaculate, that she was birthed in sandalwood, scented river water, sweet sapphire, honey-touched tongue. She was too much of a mouthful for the greedy. Just a small amount of her was more than they could stand, or they wanted her bland and barren, unspirited, un-African, uncultured, under siege in the streets. They wanted her face down, ass up, hands cuffed and ankles strapped. They wanted her knowing she could never want them back, or they wanted her holy, baptized in her divine. They wanted her secrets, pearls to swine. They wanted to unravel the mystery of her design, fascinated by glory, hypnotized by her kind, though they wanted her complete. They wanted her whole, though they came fractioned, half-hearted, half-soul, with no regards and no knowledge as to who she really was. Oh, but if they knew her, praise songs would rain from the clouds of their eyes, clearing the vision, bathing the heart. They would bow every time they saw her, be their best selves when she was around. If they knew her, knew she was the glue to their revolution, the life flow of blood through their veins. If they knew her, she would know, she would feel that her body is more than battlefield, more than bone break and bleeding bigotry, more than bridge over your troubled conscience, more than used up, walked on, driven through, shot up, more than your Selma, Lord Selma, Edmund Pettis, more than your killer Katrina Danziger, more than your bust them out of Baltimore highway to nowhere. If they knew her, she would know. Oh, yeah, me know. Que o ya o, o ya mido, que o ya, ire o ya mido, que o ya. Wild women, they walk with buffalo, have lightning on their tongues, fly wisps as weapons. Wild women, they walk with machetes, with wisdom, with grace, with ease, while women have hurricanes in their bellies, releasing a flood of a lesson. Oh, while women, they fly free. Just watch their waves, how they rip and shred. Oh, who can understand her? This winding Niger river of a woman, one who is unafraid to tear away, only to roam and then become the wind. She who speaks in gusts and cyclones, blasting us back to high ground, high consciousness. She turns, and so does the world. Feel her spinning, spanning several lifetimes. Hear her speaking, sparking alarm. See her dancing, summoning the dead, resurrecting new life. Heaven hears her, knocking on the door, safely transporting the ones who call for her assistance. While women, they open portals to new worlds, new speech, new dreams. Oh, dearly beloveds, so dearly departed from the ways of the guardian, beware, for wild women are not to be tamed, only admired. Just let her in and witness her. Set your days ablaze.
To be racialized is to be forced into a sociality, a system of meaning and value that cannot easily be warded off, as Hortense Spillers has argued. The modern colonial world wants the threat to epistemic hegemony to stay low until it chooses or demands otherwise. Racialization does work on bodies and flesh, but this work is never total in its scope, as what we just heard would reflect. The cultural productions of those racialized as Black under the colonial and capitalist racial enslavement regimes are an archive of what it might mean to break away and improvise alternative and expansive possibilities for flourishing that begin by walking after the flesh and creating spaces for intimate contact. A juke joint is an example of a possibility of this flourishing within an alternative sociality, touching, imbibing, juking, sweating out the flesh in sonic sanctuary. I contend are practices of reorientation to a flesh that senses the world from the darker side of modernity. The notes that I have prepared today signal the creative process of improvising with the blues scale and sitting with the vibrational experience of the blue note. As musical theorists and improvisational music performers will attest, the blue note is technically wrong, but sonically pleasing and satisfying, which is to say it is useful and generative discordance that can inventively reorient the listener to the other 5 notes in the scale.
So I think you just have to click from current slide and then it'll let you. There you go. There you go.
Right. Note 1, intimacy. The 18th century in the US could be described as a theater in which bodies and flesh are signified in such a way that the humanity that these symbols evoke lose their integrity, or humanity loses its integrity. This argument was recently explicated by Hortense Spillers in a lecture entitled Shades of Intimacy, What the 18th Century Teaches Us. What follows in this first note is an engagement with her pedagogical take on the crisis of intimacy that is predicated on the subjectivities that distinguish enslaved person from free persons. The distinction between body and flesh is for Spillers a way of reaching a more precise understanding of the distinction between the citizen and the alien. Bodiedness, she contends, is associated with the citizen, the juridical personality, a historical actor or agent that has access to due process. Flesh describes an alien entity, a more or less expendable figure. One can be alien, Spillers contends, by language, culture, or custom. However, for Spillers, the most poignant determination of the alien's body in comparison to the citizen's body is that it cannot ward off the citizen's touch. As such, the body of the alien loses its integrity in that it can be entered and violated without juridical recourse. The forced subject position of the enslaved is thus a robbery, in that it robs the enslaved of the power of touch. Spiller's lecture pedagogically invites the patient listener to ask, what is the touch of a mother if a child can be ripped from her at any moment? What does her touch mean if she is coerced and forced to take up the mantle of doing mothering-like acts without being able to take the bond of parent and child for granted? What is a healing touch upon flesh if it can be undone again and again? Approaching these questions, Spillers leverages her own theorization of the captive enslaved body that is reduced to flesh, which she calls a 0 degree of social conceptualization. Such a reduction is not an ontological change per se, but it is onto so far as the regime of racial slavery requires the existence and naturalization of enslaved subjectivity, or at least the myth that it has happened. With Spillers, one can learn how the integrity of the body is ripped away from the enslaved through the legal status of being property. This status permits the fleshy desires of enslavers to run wild, or the master class to run wild without the threat of legal recourse, or in many cases, moral or ethical infraction. As Spillers argues, this has profound consequences for intimacy, not only for the enslaved, but for the master class of the enslavement regime. Consider an enslaver that breaks familial bonds at will amongst the enslaved for the sake of profit or pleasure. What does this say about how the master class value their official family bonds within their own households? The same could be said, as Spillers argues, about the integrity of intramural intimacy amongst the master class. Romantic, sexual. What does it mean for the slaveholders to have an official family record and a shadow family born of the sexual liaison between enslaved and enslaver, alien, citizen? Under this reality, intimacy and its shades are under a profound crisis and an unexpected tension, and there's an unexpected extension of erotic flows out of the application of private property to human bodies. Owning chattel is thus tantamount to securing both the means of production and its excess use value in an economy of desire, fetish, and pleasure. As Spillers argues so long ago in Mama's Baby, Papa's Maybe American Grammar book, the property status of the captive body holds within it potential for pornotroping, which signals then the level of depth to which intimacy is in crisis, in which there are those who cannot ward off touch. Under these circumstances, there is intimate proximity, intimate touch, but neither guarantee intimacy. Note 2. Y'all see that? I think we should have our liberty because us ain't hogs or horses. Us is human flesh. Tom Wyndham. In his text, Sentient Flesh, Thinking in Disorder, Poesis in Black, R.A. Judy interprets these words as an instantiation of poesis in Black, which offer an understanding of how one might break with the regimes of domination that rob bodies of their integrity. Judy offers a meditation on the discordant nature of Wyndham's words, which disorder the representation of Black flesh as private property. I engage him on the way to a reflection on the decolonization of Black religious experience that I find to be significant for the scholarship of African American theologies. This decolonization is aimed at delinking the interpretation of Black religion from categories of the primitive and the civilized, following historian of religions Charles Long's work And he argued that these are predicated on how the human is differentiated from the flesh of animals, right? And this is actually what I meant to say there is that Judy's work predicates this on the nexus of the animal and the human, which is differentiated from what Long is arguing with respect to the primitive and the civilized. So I'm trying to see how Judy adds to this nexus as important for how we reflect on Black religious experience. Thomas Wyndham was a 92-year-old freedman whose enslavement experience was recorded by Bernice Bowden in Pine Bluff, Arkansas, sometime in 1937. Their recording was a part of the 696 recorded interviews of enslaved persons done in Arkansas, some of you may know this source, of a 2-year period by the Work Progress Administration Federal Writers Project. It was later compiled into a 17-volume work for the Library of Congress and is entitled Slave Narratives, a Folk History of Slavery in the United States from Interviews with Former Slaves. Judy's work analyzes Wyndham's words with respect to 4 major ideas: ontology, taxonomy, and semiosis, which work together to illumine what Judy will theorize as parasemiosis and poesis in Black. We'll get to those in a minute. With respect to ontology, Judy contends that Wyndham's statement, "We deserve our liberty because us is human flesh," rings unique because Wyndham's notion of liberty is predicated on human flesh rather than, as Judy says, being beyond the flesh. Such a statement is discordant with the assumptions that haunt the recorders of the WPA, who in many instances see their work as filling out preconceived notions about the meaning and value of Black existence. These projects, according to Judy, are animated by what the principal organizer and preparer of the interview questions, Alan Lomax, referred to as the essence of Negro folk culture. In other projects, Lomax recorded Black folk songs. There, he described the recording of Black music as intimate, poetic, and musical expressions of unlettered people. He goes on in another instance, he says the population was entirely Black, that he was, gonna do his field work on. Plantations were of a great number of Negroes, and they exceeded whites. In the Mississippi Delta, this space yielded Negro songs that in musical phrasing and in poetic content are most unlike that of the white race, that least contaminated by white influence or modern Negro jazz. You can already hear here that Lomax's folkloric curation is methodologically attached to an ontology of primitivism, which associates Black existence with a pure folk essence, as if they can't decide when they want to move on sonically from one thing to the other. Wyndham's statement is discordant with the recorder's expectation to isolate a pure folk sound, and that this notion of humanity has to do with the sentience of his flesh, rather than an ontological essence. In addition to ontological discordance, Wyndham's words also offer, as Judy says, a discrepant taxonomy. He argues that Wyndham's reflection on flesh invokes a notion of difference that places him in horizontal rather than vertical distinction from the animal. Judy highlights this when he argues that Wyndham's words are zoologically signaling a difference amongst animals rather than taxonomically pointing to a difference between classes of beings. In other words, Wyndham's ain't, us ain't hogs or horses, evokes a difference at the level of flesh that makes him fit for liberty. There is a fleshy commonality and difference that frames Wyndham's liberty. To get at this, Judy argues that Wyndham's flesh is sentient, which marks him as a different species of animal, but still human. Wyndham thought Black human flesh should be free because enslaved Black human flesh is self-aware in ways that distinguish it from other animals. As such, Wyndham's claim is classificatory with respect to sentient flesh and is discrepant with classificatory claims that draw a hard line between the zoological and the anthropological. Wyndham's taxonomic intervention is also political in nature. The political taxonomic intervention is based on what he sees as a substantive difference, quoting Judy here, in how Wyndham distinguishes humanity as requisite for liberty. For Wyndham, political freedom is not based on a transcendent notion of the human, but something that is approaching or embodying what Spiller says as the 0 degree of social difference amongst humans. Judy proves this in a compelling way by comparing Wyndham's notion of liberty predicated upon human flesh with notions of liberty that are based upon natural rights, individual freedom, the social characteristics of human personhood. There's much more to say here, but suffice it to say that the difference that Wyndham's taxonomy makes is that it deploys a horizontal rather than a vertical sense of the natural. As such, liberty for Wyndham, according to Judy, is not predicated upon claims about the capacity of reason, inalienable rights, or personhood in its Lockean and Aristotelian forms. All of these claims to liberty are based upon a taxonomic differentiation in which the human is distinguished by the capacity to transcend their relationship to the animal through faith or reason. This capacity for faith or reason, as Judy argues, is conferred by God or an existential humanistic notion of nature, as we see with natural rights. The social order of capitalist racial slavery, where order is determined by the pursuit of capital and the securing of slave labor, are transcendentally bestowed. It's a transcendentally bestowed capacity, as Judy would argue, of the human for the practice of faith and reason is leveraged to justify the violation of inalienable rights. The fact that the human integrity lies outside of culture or outside of contingency is leveraged negatively against the enslaved. As Judy points out via his analysis of John Locke's way of distinguishing the human as a social person and the human as animal, the universality of modern ways of understanding personhood or man or rights fall into a crisis of contradiction that is brought into limited relief with a semiological intervention, not a political intervention, but a semiological intervention, that signifies the Negro as more animal than human, and thus makes the West African, for instance, naturally fit to be owned as property. While Judy is careful to identify that some of this is in excess of Locke's notion of conditions in which persons can be alienated from their rights, think about the parental, so to speak, it is nevertheless the semiological reality in which Wyndham and his contemporaries find themselves. In order to ensure the descent of the African into the property system of capitalist racial slavery, it was required that the Negro body be negatively distinguished from the human body. It is here that we can see at least the beginnings of what Judy means by poesis in black with respect to Wyndham's claims. When read with respect to semiosis, the study and interpretation of signification, let me see here. I'll show you a visual of what this looks like. Wyndham's discordance with ontology and his discrepant taxonomy come into fuller view as an activity of meaning making and improvisation that is appositional to the normative semiological order. It's just not so much concerned with it. Judy signifies this appositional improvisation on the semiological order of racial enslavement and the afterlife of enslavement as parasemiosis, which works out of the poetic statement or the statement that Wyndham is making, which is not yet what he would want to necessarily call poetic, but it has a kind of a poetic element to it. Poesis in black is thus, as Judy contends, an instantiation of parasemiosis and the basis on which a new sociality. For me, I want to consider this new sociality with respect to blues socialities. Let's sit with Ma Rainey's Prove It On Me blues, at least a few stanzas. Went out last night, had a great big fight. Everything seemed to go wrong. I looked up to my surprise. The gal that I was with was gone. Where she went, I don't know. I mean to follow her everywhere she goes. Folks say I'm crooked. I didn't know where she took it. I want the whole world to know. Rainey, like Wyndham, is performing lyrics in an ontologically discordant way in Prove It On Me Blues, and resisting the taxonomic grip of the captive body and how it almost overdetermines the possibility for self-affirmation with respect to or irrespective of gender and sexuality. Rainey's poesis in Black, if you will, performs appositional to and irrespective of the ontological boundary set by a pathological Blackness that in the post-emancipation environment, which was featured on that diagram, would render her notion of intimacy as a cause of social disorder. So she resists that and even says they gotta prove it on me. And those of you who know this song is somewhat historical, as she was at a party and was arrested for inciting what people have imagined to be a queer sexual party. So Kelly Brown Douglas in her work, Black Bodies in the Black Church at Blues Slant argues that blues bodies like Ma Rainey's offer a route to recovering the body as a basis for how Black faiths relate to divinity. Similar to Rainey's words, she is concerned about the internalization of body negative tropes within evangelical faith narratives. The embrace of the flesh and body in blues music thus invites Black churches to face and deal with their body negative forms of religiosity. We see a root or a conjurational healing for this haunting in songs like Wild Women Don't Worry, Wild Women Don't Have the Blues, in which an embrace of the wild, the very thing that the modern colonial world was built to overcome, is healing to the ailment of worry. As the theological insights of Dolores Williams has shown, the ground of meeting divinity is the wilderness and the sentient flesh, if you will, in which Black women in particular sense their way towards God as God visits them in their activities of survival and quality of life. Note 3. With these notes and the sociality of the juke joint and blues women in mind, and also womanist theologies as instantiations of poesis in Black, I want to turn towards how I see the project of Black studies as important not only for thinking through the coloniality of race, being, and gender, but also for thinking about a decolonial theory of religion that is now being taken up by scholars like Anyute, Diane Stewart, and Tracy Hucks. To do this, I want to see the prospect of decolonial theory, or think about it, a decolonial theory of religion as connected to, if not prefigured by, a debate that takes place between historian of religion Charles Long and James Cone. I hope the audience will forgive me as my engagement with these two Black male scholars is reductive. They do not represent their respective disciplines on their own might. However, I will proceed in order to reflect upon their discordance with their field of studies and where that discordance can grow. The debate has been formative to my ability to sense the insights of decolonial theory, as Long and Cone were assigned readings during my undergraduate days at Xavier in Louisiana, where I met Stephen, as you already know, but Stephen gave me eventually Anibal Quijano's work on the coloniality of power, and Charles Long had already primed me to be receptive of some of the arguments in that text. So this third note can be seen as a note on the route to an improvisation, and this is for you, Steve. All right. So the debate between Long and Cone was recently summarized and interpreted in an article by Victor Anderson entitled Flesh Stuff, The Matter of the Reality of God. He beat me to this, as he should. But at any rate, in that text, it's helpful to kind of situate the improvisational moments that I've kind of went through in each of the notes. The debate between Cone and Long can quickly be summarized in a question. Where do we look for divine presence in Black lives? At first glance, one might argue that this is a question rooted in theodicy, or perhaps a critique of theodicy. Why does God allow anti-Black racism? Which is riffing on another scholar and a friend of theirs, William R. Jones. Looking for divine presence in Black lives already assumes that the task of looking is necessary, and thus another more fundamental question is at stake in the debate. Do Black lives matter to God? If so, how do we know? Cone and Long answer these questions alongside others like Joseph Washington, William R. Jones, as I mentioned, and then I would add here Zora Neale Hurston, and you can go on to the Weisenfeld and a more contemporary key in non-Christian sources, particularly. Who asked? So to answer or approach these questions, both scholars had to begin with the close and patient listening and then interpretation of Black religious experience. On one side of the debate, Cone wanted to interpret Black religious experience theologically by arguing that that experience is an encounter with the God of the oppressed, and that the God of the oppressed is the most salient mediation of the Christian God, not only for Black lives, but for all lives. On the other side of the debate, Long, a historian of religion, was concerned with developing a theory of Black religion, which was critically informed by a phenomenological approach to Black religious experience. That is, an approach that reads the activities of religious experience as they appear in the flesh stuff, and without respect to predetermined categories in the study of religion and theology. Cone distrusted white theologies, as he called it, ability to understand the authenticity and autonomy of Black Christian witness, and thus the far-reaching implications of disentangling theological discourse from the discourses of modern oppression. Long distrusted theological discourse, Cone's Black theological discourse included, because it was not thoroughly informed by his taste to the breadth and depth of the phenomena of Black religion, which he thought pointed to a new orientation to God, and also Africa, and the situation or condition of the involuntary presence of people from Africa in the New World. He didn't think that any of this could be mediated in theological terms. So Black theological discourse, according to Long, needed to engage the descent into opacity. Anderson's insight into the debate is his attention to the flesh and body in the words of Long. Here they are. These bodies of opacity, these loci of meaninglessness, were paradoxically loci of a surplus of meaning, meanings incapable of universal expression during the period of oppression. These opaque ones were centers from which gods were made. They were the concrete embodiments of matter, made significant in the modern world. They formed new rhythms in time and space. These bodies of opacity were facts of history and symbols of a new religious depth. The totalization of all the great ideals of Western universalization met with the factual symbol of these oppressed ones. Opaque theologies emerged because the strategies of obscuring these people and cultures within the taxonomies of the disciplines of anthropology as primitives, or the classification of them as sociological pathologies, which Ma Rainey is helping us with, is no longer possible. In commenting on these words, Anderson simply writes, "So you have it." Black flesh is the matter of the reality of God or gods in the religious situation of the opaque ones. in and through Black bodies, flesh stuff, opaque, the reality of God or gods materializes not merely as a matter of ontological concern, but materiality in flesh. With this brief engagement with Long, Cone, and Anderson in mind, we are now in a better position to sit with what I understand as the significance of Black studies. That is, producing a theological demand that is at least as old in its academic treatments as the Cone and Long debates of the 60s and 70s. This demand might require us to think through how sentient flesh and the nexus between the human and the animal haunts the interpretation of Black religious experience as a notion of reorienting a people, not only to as Long says, a loci of meaninglessness, but also the animal and ecological life worlds, space, land, which were used to signify the loci of meaninglessness. So it's not just about meaninglessness, it's how the animal and the land were used and leveraged to talk about and then signify meaninglessness on flesh. Zakiya Iman Jackson's work, Becoming Human, which I'm not gonna have time to get through today. I didn't plan to get through it, but it's pointing to where we're going. She illumines the challenge of Black studies to the study of religion and theology, and so far, even though it's not her intention, as she suggests that a praxis of reorientation might require delinking from what she describes via Derrida as the sentimental signification of the difference between the human and the animal. It's just about what one wants to assume is their set apartness from the animal. And they're usually doing this from a position of power. So with Long and Black studies scholars, we have covered in these notes, I want us to sit with and end with and consider how Black studies work might be used to strike inventive improvisations on Long's blues, which would not work without the counterstatement of Cone's blues captured in these words. I thought I had it here. It's okay, I'll read it. The oppressed have faced the hardness of life. This hardness of life, or of reality, was the experience of the meaning of the oppressed one's own identity as opaque next to the animal. Reality itself was opaque and seemed opposed to them, and this is me, the chattel animal made into human flesh. The affirmations Black is beautiful or God is red are more than mere slogans, they are insert poesis in Black and parasemiosis, a shorthand for the agonizing history of the communities that have had to face the ultimacy of reality as a daily experience in the modern world. The matter of God, improvisation, and the matter of the flesh is what is being experienced. This may be an old God, improvisation, or an old flesh, but all gods, flesh, are new gods, flesh. The experience of this God cannot be in the older theological languages, taxonomies and ontologies of domination. This God has evoked a new beat, a new rhythm, a new movement, a new touch. It is a God that must be commensurate with the agony of oppression, a touch that cannot be warded off, and the freedom of all persons, or the sociality of a planetary juke joint. The hardness of life for the oppressed is not just the physical violence that they experience, gruesome as it is, but it's the recognition that that is only a symptom of a greater violation, the rendering of their own identity as opaque. Black American cultural production is at its best a performance of meaning that throws the darkness cast upon it into crisis, as it posits another luminous darkness by which beloved flesh may reorient itself to the spirit. In the dark. That's it.
Thank you so much for that really fascinating talk. We have 20 minutes for questions, so I think it's a good amount of time for some discussion. Becca and I both have microphones that we can hand out to you if you don't mind just raising your hand. Lori, there you go.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's great to have you back here. So I want to ask a question about disciplines. One of the things that I both heard from you before you started giving this talk and then also during the talk itself, of course, is sort of this question specifically as it pertains to Black studies. And one of the things that I'm walking away from this talk with is this idea that theology has much to offer Black studies. And so I'm kind of curious about how you situate that in what I think is a generally secular landscape. And then by extension, I'm assuming that you would all argue that theology or theological studies would then also have things offer European studies and vice
Sure.
And I think that the same paradigm of the secular would be relevant as well. So I'm just curious to hear you think about that a little bit.
Sure.
Thank you once again.
Sure. Thank you, Court. Really appreciate the question. So there's already working. So there's two forces at play, or maybe three, that kind of put pressure on what I'm trying to say and what I'm trying to articulate. One of them is that secularism is already an allergy of many theological perspectives. There's an allergy towards the secular in theology that sometimes might be an allergy to the categories that I mentioned, the civilization versus the primitive, the animal and the human, and the way that I kind of talk about how those categories are used to throw people out of universal claims about humanity. And so as this is particularly problematic for marginalized groups who, after having been made opaque to themselves and to their religious experiences, you can think about the boarding schools that Native Americans undergo, where they lose their language and then can no longer pray because the guys, as Wendy Boy would say, don't speak English. So there's an experience like that the discourse and language that are used to try to talk about that are always and already looped in with the allergy that some theological perspectives have with the secular. So that's one pressure. So how I see this is that the blues has always been, as Albert Murray would say, a counterstatement to Black theological claims outside of academic discourse, in churches, on pews, in homes. And in that reality, there's play back and forth. There's entering and exiting. There's appreciation, fight. It's a familial argument, but it has a containment. Part of that containment I've been offering today is at the level of this sentient flesh that Judy is arguing. So I see what Black Studies is doing as a kind of a shadow theology. J. Cameron Carter would kind of talk about it as a paratheology. And he's talking about folks like Moten in the wake of this, Fred Moten. So the reality is that they're using, oftentimes, in ways that they might not want to admit, tropes that come out of religious reality and religious experience. Even Moten, as some of the scholars in the grad program I've had the time to spend with, is working going. Where is she? Did she leave? Yeah, she left. Is engaging categories like mystical, right? And so then the question then is like, how do you get them to be honest? Spiller's dissertation is done on sermons, right? I don't think Spillers would have this kind of allergy against the discourse because she saw that discourse as viable enough to be a data set for her work. But she was trying to show, like, when you put a sermon on paper, it speaks different. The categories do different things than when it's preached in an environment where there's expectation, there's repetition, there's a long-standing tradition. The pastor probably done preached that sermon a whole bunch of times, or elements of it, and back and forth, right? And so she was trying to look at it as a piece of literature, right, as a grammar. And so I think that's enriching. A preacher could get that and say, well, now, if I had this, right, I'd do something a little bit different, or as the Oblates of Blues would say, you can't preach the gospel if you ain't got the blues. You ain't had the blues. And so all I'm saying is there a kind of forgetting of the blues of the flesh born out of religious experience in Black studies? That's the question I'm asking. So yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Hello, thank you so much, Dr. Burnett, for this just phenomenal presentation, and it's causing me to ask questions about my own dissertation, which has drifted into the waters of Black religious studies in ways that I didn't anticipate as a theologian. And I'm wondering, just thinking about my own project, if this debate, if you will, between theologians and Black religious studies scholars is perhaps a false dichotomy, and instead thinking about Black religious studies and theology as hermeneutics that are attempting to answer a bigger question, which is the question that I'm coining this in my dissertation, like the meta-narrative of diaspora, which is the existential and ontological situation of discontinuity with Africa. I would say that's the problem. That's attempting to be resolved, solved, addressed. And so I'm wondering what you think about that, if of Long's theory of religion and then like subsequent scholarship, we know Black theology, womanist theology that emerges in the 60s and 70s. If these are all attempts at trying to answer this existential question that diaspora has created.
Yes, I mean Lawrence says that verbatim. He says that you would agree with him.
Yes.
Because he says in his construction of a theory of Black religion, he talks about it as 3 orientations. The first orientation is to Africa. The second orientation is to the involuntary presence of Africans in the West or in the New World, right? And then the third is an orientation to God. The problem is that the only, like I'm suggesting, I think I want to make sure that I take some blame for the dichotomic thing that you're saying. I put these two guys side by side. They're in a community talking about this amongst other folks. And even though we're saying Long said this, Cone said that, I think they have 2 different approaches that may or may not clarify approaches. And so I think it's an open conversation. I think that there's a fluidity that both of them have meta-narrative kinds of claims. Cone's is with respect to the will of God. God wills to be with and visit the oppressed that are racialized as Black. He's really clear about that. It's not necessarily anything that they do that's special that allows for this visitation to happen, but that God wills it. And so the chronicling is of God's free will to be present in Black life, which is why he kind of like pushes back on Cone, because he's saying like, how are you going to account for this? Because when I go to church on Sunday, this is what's going on, right? And when I look at my ancestors, this is what is going on. The problem is that the kind of academic reality that swells around Cone and Long.
That's what I was asked, is
that
it's almost that the discipline is creating the dichotomy though. The discipline itself is separating them apart and saying that theologians are doing something different than us, when no, I think both are lenses that are attempting to grasp that existential question that is diaspora. That's my thesis.
No, I think you're on good ground. I'm not troubling it. I'm just trying to make sure that I took my own credit for putting a kind of dichotomy out there that I don't think exists. But yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think that plays for sure.
Well, I can ask a question while others are thinking about if they have other questions. And this is a question very much as someone who's not a theologian at all and is not in any way versed in theology. But yesterday we talked a bit about how, you've been a musician most of your life. And so I'm wondering, how do you see the relationship between your own personal relationship to music and your history with music with your overall scholarship? Has it always been central to what you do? And just thinking about, I'm a historian who teaches about art with my students, and I'm always thinking about, sources and how we get them to think about, maybe look at sources we hadn't actually considered as real sources as a way of kind of accessing voices that are too often overlooked. And I'm wondering if you see music as a potential kind of avenue for thinking, as an avenue for beginning to kind of decolonize how we think about these issues.
Yeah. I think that there's a kind of a caution there for me, because there's a way in which the category of music that also has fraught symbol systems that need to be, in light of the theme of this series, decolonized. So in other words, music is not neutral. Is not universally benevolent to the project. It has to be approached, and I think one of the discordant ways, I've been talking about discordance, is to think about music as sound first, and then to think about music as a kind of a instantiation of sound that is amongst other instantiations of sound or sounding. And so that means that music evokes a certain type of orientation towards sound, but it's not. It doesn't have a monopoly on how we orient ourselves towards sound. And I think sometimes the way we think about music kind of moves towards that line of over-determining how we orient ourselves towards sound. And so the other thing is that when you think about music, you're also thinking about oftentimes the performative moment as the only moment of the experience. And usually that moment is cut off from a wild array of relationships. Think about a drum. Back before we had synthetic plastics and polymers and different things, something had to die and be stretched across something in the right way. Natural stuff, trees, animals, plants. Sound comes out of this rich ecological reality, and a reality that is connected with a notion of the divine. If you look at, and I know African traditional religions is a kind of a fraught term now, but at the same time, that the Orishas have a sound. They have a rhythm, they have a beat that's connected to all that deep ecology that I just described. So if music does not obfuscate that, I'm all with it.
Okay, we have a question from Mira.
Well, so yeah, that was the term performative was sort of the center of my question. I took a long time to raise my hand because I'm not sure what the articulation is exactly. But I think a lot with feminist scholars, performativity is going to be a big part, and I notice obviously the emphasis on blues. And actually maybe it was a little bit primed by the joke that like you're performing when you're even giving this talk, right? And of course you put on a performance, and but that performativity, and I was thinking about it too, like the police of blackness, and then you also started off the conversation with bodies and the difference between alien and citizen bodies. But I think performativity for gender studies scholars gives us this sort of constructivist understanding of those categories. But it seemed like I can go on for a long time because the question's almost like not there. I just want you to like say something, like think about that, because yeah.
So when you say constructivist, I hear you saying that the performance is constructing something.
Mm-hmm.
True. But are you problematizing that is the case, or are you like okay with that being the case?
With okay with the case of the performance
Being constructive or constructing.
of constructing.
Yeah.
I probably would problematize
Yes, sure,
that. Yeah.
sure.
Yeah.
Okay, so you think it's not constructing?
Not necessarily.
Okay.
That there are that, but I also think the performative constructivists too. I think would also mean that there are sort of like symbols and things already in place that for gender performance I sort of pick and choose what I put on to decide how to construct.
Oh, I
Does
see.
that make sense?
Yes.
And then you were talking about the blues note being, and I think Judith Butler would love the phrase, and I don't take Judith Butler everywhere, but like she would love they would love the phrase of the blues note is wrong and yet it produces beauty, right? It's technically wrong, but yet it produces, you didn't say beauty, you said something else. But I read exactly.
Pleasure, joy,
Pleasure, yeah.
It's pleasurable sound.
Pleasurable sound, yeah. And so how that performance of, maybe goes to Laura's question too, like the performativity of blackness and the performativity of music.
Well, yeah, I mean, if you want to talk about like Black musical performance as an instantiation of an a priori conceived notion of blackness, then yeah, sometimes that happens, right? You know, Lomax is the example of Lomax is an instantiation of that happening. Lomax knows what Black music is, and he's just going to try to preserve it. But that presumes that blackness is not extensive in a way that you know with a certainty that that person is pulling down that symbol by which you could muster a critique of it being mimetic or something like this. Yeah. So what I'm saying is that that's what Black Studies is helping us with, because what they're trying to say, and Zakiya Mon Jackson talks about this, is that if you take the nexus between the human and the animal, for instance, the problem with that nexus, and she's drawn on Derrida for this, and I'll get back to the sound, but she says with Derrida, you know, humans don't really know how distinct they are from animals. Right? It's a guess. It's an educated guess. It can be an educated guess. But what do you do with speciation in evolutionary theory? Because species keep forming. Species contract. They go extinct. Do you account for that when you talk about the difference between the human and the animal? Or does the difference always stay the same? When that difference stays the same, that is a parallel kind of notion of the performative out of the pre-constructed categorical relation to what codes as Black music, white music, this kind of music, that kind of music, this kind of sexuality, this kind of sexuality, that kind of sexuality. So the thing is, what Zakiya Mon Jackson is saying is like, no, let's go with an extensive understanding of the animal, right? So that the differencing of the human from the animal is in a state, as she says, of becoming, right? And so in that becoming, if I go back to theological terms, I'm thinking about saving paradise and reading Nakashima Brock's work, because they're basically saying that the cross over-determines the extensive way in which we might relate to Eden as a spatial kind of concern in which there's a flourishing and the presencing of God that is very different than the presence that we get at the crucifixion and the resurrection. Even though we know that all of these things are somehow working together in religious life, Eden don't get a lot of airtime in comparison to the cross, right? And they're saying, what does that mean for bodies that undergo that experience on a regular basis as a kind of in a mundane way that are looking for that Edenic experience? So in other works, I've talked about blues as a kind of return to a kind of Edenistic being with divinity, rather than, and you see that not only in the juke joint, but you see it in agrarian, or you see it in agricultural co-ops. You see it in homesteading amongst Black Americans when they go from one space to another to create towns with little resources. I think one of the examples that comes to mind is Nicodemus. Is it Kansas? You might heard of this? Yes. But yeah, so I don't know if I've answered your question, but
No, that was great. Yeah, that's exactly what. Yeah, I just wanted to hear what you thought. That.
So we're at time, but I'm gonna let Stephen have the last question.
boy, you did a dangerous thing.
Well, thank you very much, Rufus, for this presentation. I had a quick clarification question. You had said there was ontology, semiosis. This was in note 2, and there was a second thing in between ontology and semiosis. Do you remember just off the bat what that was?
It's ontology, taxonomy.
Oh, taxonomy. Okay, so ontology, taxonomy, and semiosis. So I guess my question is related to that and the move that Judy does in terms of the semiotic, saying that the flesh is within this particular domination system, the flesh is signified upon, right? And in Thomas Wyndham is pointing to something else, right? Something that's not captured by this particular signification. And so, I'm wondering about the ontology and semiosis. This is just a general thought, and then maybe this pertains to theology or to some of our dominant discourses in general. But to bring in some of this language like of nominalism, it sounds like someone could say that Judy is proposing some form of nominalism, right? Where there's a gap between our world and the language, our world of language and the real world. That universals are no more than names assigned to them. And within theology, right? Nominalism for some is like an extraordinarily bad thing. I don't deal with nominalism or anything like that, but I'm just wondering about this question because I guess what I'm wondering is if we see among some marginalized groups or people thinking and theorizing within and among marginalized groups, if we see what could be termed maybe or perceived as a kind of nominalism, what does it mean if it's even appropriate to call it nominalism? This nominalism as an epistemic step in the process of liberation. So if Judy, by way of his semiotic turn, is doing something analogous to a kind of nominalism, right? He's then sort of downplaying ontology. And what does it mean that in history we can see real people when they start thinking about these things saying, no, that is just that is a label you have put on me. That is not the reality, right? Whereas it seems like dominant groups seem to really love ontology, right? So I guess I'm wondering if you could just say something
Sure.
general.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I see where you're going. Judy is in a debate and a fight, possibly with his friends, Nahum Chandler and Fred Moten, who want to talk about para-ontology, right? And Judy is saying like, nah, bro, I don't think para-ontology is what's going on with Ted Wyndham's example, right? He's not trying to be appositional to ontology. He's trying to be appositional to the thing that ontology is claiming to have done, he rephrase. He's trying to be para to the thing that is really going on when folks start trying to claim ontological dominance, which is they're signifying themselves and they're signifying the other as this schema, which comes from I'm gonna box the name, the semiologist Barthes. Yeah. So he goes into an analysis of Barthes and the signifier, the signifying, and signified. So, but Barthes is dealing with this with respect to myth, and Judy like leverages it to kind of talk about the myths cast upon the captive body, which he gets from Spiller. So you can see here that the mythical signifier, the meaning and form, flesh, enslaved, captive body, is mythically signified as social political order of racialized capitalist slavery. So in other words, the West African, or what would become the Negro, is a symbol that only makes sense, or a signifier that only makes sense within the confines of social political order of racialized capitalist slavery, right? But then there's a shift that in history after emancipation, the failure of the Reconstruction and so forth, in which pathology becomes and social disorder becomes the way in which the symbol that of the Negro or the Black that signifies like ethnicity or some bond to a particular location, all this within the dominant order is troubled, right? And so people start to make all these kind of like biological claims, to your point of nominalism, about what's wrong with the Negro, or what's wrong with this ethnic group. But the only reason they can talk about what's wrong is because they have a semiosis of a matriarchal family structure that is built. So anybody that's read the Moynihan Report, you understand what's going on here, as Spillers, as he's drawing on Spillers to get this. So at the end is a case for national action against this so-called ethnicity, which is really just those who are othered by patriarchal family structure.
Thank you so much.